The Metaverse is emerging as the next big technology platform and promises to be the next frontier for human experiences on the internet. Into the Metaverse covers companies, technologies, and trends that are bringing these promises to life. Join creator and host Jonathan Ross-Friedman, founder and CEO of Supersocial, as he interviews the brilliant minds that are building, shaping, and investing in the Metaverse.
Welcome to Into the Metaverse. I'm Jon, and joining me today is Maxim Perumal. Maxim is the founder of Unai, makers of a VR headset and virtual world dedicated to making human interactions look, feel, and sound like they do in real life. Unai is funded by NFX, Stride, Y Combinator, and David Helgeson, the founder of Unity Game Engine, among others. Previously, Maxim built Relativity, a popular open source VR headset, when he was 15 years old. He open sourced it after Meta invited him to meet with Oculus chief architect, which I'm very curious about that story as well, Maxim, so we're going to dig in. But in the meantime, I'm delighted to welcome you on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I want to start with your actual story, Maxim. How did you get into VR initially and working on something like Relativity?
Sure. So for context, I grew up in France, in the countryside of France, and a lot of my time I spent in virtual worlds growing up, right? And like being the only teenager in my village, that was kind of the only way to make friends. It was online. And Minecraft was one of those places where I spent lots and lots and lots of time, made online friends, and started building things for us. And I'm sure 99% of the people that listen to your podcast are super familiar with Minecraft, but just in case, one of the particular thing about Minecraft is you can just write your own code in Java and pretty much build anything, right? If you're willing to go the extra steps, you can build your own server, you can host them yourself, you can deploy them yourself and add functionality to the game. And it's basically a big sandbox. And that took all of my attention and focus. I became obsessed with creating the best Minecraft worlds I possibly could and having my friends in them, right? And then we started expanding to the friends of my friends, and it became those sort of online servers where all of those people were hanging out. And to me, it felt almost like being the mayor of a small city, right? Where I started hiring my other teenage friends to help me with the design and then to help me with writing code. And then we were hosting everything on computers that we got from school, and those were not powerful enough anymore. So we had to find a way to make a bit of money and host them on other servers. And so I did that for a while. I didn't go to school that much as a kid, but I was ecstatic to do that thing on the computer on Minecraft. And then the first turning point is Oculus at the time comes out with the Oculus DK 2, I believe, which was their second generation of a VR headset. And that VR headset was, if you remember, it was pretty darn expensive, right? About $1,000. And I'm a teenager, I'm like 14, so of course I cannot afford to buy that thing. And so I think to myself, well, if I cannot buy it, maybe I can find a way to build it or build something quite similar. And so I started doing just that, spent about a year trying to work on this. And my blessing and the curse was that I had no idea what I was doing. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the very basics of the sort of physics of how do I track an object moving in space. And the math of it is like, because I was 14, right? And I started writing my own firmware. I was already a decent C programmer. I already had done some electronics. So I started putting all of those things together. And at the time, my math tutor gives me a little bit of money, right? Because I had the money and to buy a bunch of displays. So I get those displays, write new drivers for them, put that thing together, and basically ends up with a VR headset. And in terms of features, that was pretty much just as good as what I could have bought. So I started posting about it online. And of course, Facebook at the time, Meta now, hears about it. They reach out. I think they probably wondered, why is a kid in the middle of Europe building a VR headset in his bedroom? But eventually I sort of show my stuff to people around and they end up flying me to the US. So I go to the US, meet with some of the leadership over there and meet with some of their engineers, and most notably, get to meet with Atman Beanstalk, their chief architect. And I have this wonderful meeting where I'm like, wow, this guy gets it. Everything I'm talking about, everything I'm obsessed about, I can talk about those things with this guy. You have to imagine being a 14 years old, like building VR headset. It was like the first time I could just like talk about VR for hours. And I think that's probably what happened. If I remember correctly, I think we're scheduled the first time we met to talk for half an hour. And we probably talked for 3 to 4 hours, just like me wanting to talk about VR so badly, right? So that part was fantastic. But then what I realized was that my vision for VR and where I was coming from really had some profound differences with the way the leadership at Facebook that came from the world of apps, the world of mobile, and really the world of Facebook and Instagram, basically, that those two visions were quite different. And frankly, I felt like they didn't understand a thing about VR. And so I took everything I had built, the hardware, software, firmware, and open sourced everything. And it became this sort of online group of people contributing to it. And we contributed to a bunch of stuff. Some of the stuff I built back then is I started to build renderers for Unity, for VR specifically, and started spending a lot of time with the people from Unity, sort of tinkering with the engine and trying to improve the performances of the VR4 shaders. And as you mentioned, that ultimately led me to have Unity founder and ex-CEO David be one of our first investors in Unai, my new company to this day. But yeah, I basically then dropped out of school. I was 15, I think, actually, and just went full on researching VR and doing this hardcore engineering, learning from fantastic people on the internet that were contributing to my open source thing. So I did that for a while, and that's how I got into VR. And since then, it's been probably 6-7 years, and I've been using VR every single day since. So that's the story of how I got to be really into VR.
That's fantastic. What a fascinating story, Maxim. And we're going to dig in on a few things of where you are now and where you're heading. But I'm curious, you said something interesting that in the meeting with Facebook's leadership, you saw key differences. And I'm curious, looking backwards from where you are today, 5, 6, 7 years after those meetings and after you've released Relativity as open source, what were some of those fundamental differences that you believed to have identified in the conversation with them? And also, are those differences still exist today with what Meta is doing with Oculus and Horizon and the way you're thinking about VR? And I know we're going to talk more about Unai and dig in further on those differences, but I'm just curious, if you look backward at that conversation, what were the key philosophical differences that you had between what you thought and between how they thought about it?
Sure. I love that question. And it's always one that is tough to answer because the truth is that there are always two things that are very true simultaneously. One of them is that there's a very sort of a higher level philosophical difference that seems extremely abstract and hardly actionable. And then is a long tail of hundreds of tiny details that I would have done differently. And so maybe what I can do is try, it's going to be a long answer, but maybe I can try to give you a feel of those two things, of the abstract philosophical one and then the long tail of details. And I know many of the people that listen to you are sort of interested in the metaverse, of course, right? So even maybe more so than VR. And so maybe a good starting point for an answer is to take a little bit of a step back from VR and try to ask, what is the metaverse, right? And if I do this, all right, here's one way to look at it. If we try to ask what is the metaverse, my sort of go-to answer is going to be that the medium is the message. And I'll go ahead and try to explain that. If I try to think of what are 3 big mediums of the way that people interact with each other and like things that have shaped society in like very profound ways. I would say between the 20th and like 21st century, I can think of three very important mediums. The first one would be in 1935, and that would be the Rural Electrification Administration. So, in the US, 1935, they built this administration dedicated to putting electricity in the homes of rural America. Like you have to imagine that was like a pretty new thing and a pretty innovative one, right? Putting electricity in the houses that did not have it. And people were calling that the phase of getting out of the dark age, quite literally. And so what it did is it brought light to the house of people. And that's why I want to go back a little bit to this, the medium is the message idea. So that's not an idea from me, of course, it's Marshall McLuhan ideas. And what it basically means is if you look at something like news broadcasting and you get specific piece of content in news broadcasting, like that only tells you a little bit of the story. The bigger picture, the most influential stuff is the fact that now, whilst people are having dinner, creams are being broadcasted on their TV. And now this is part of the social fabric of society, that you watch the news while you eat, and the news is telling you about crimes that you might otherwise might have heard about, right? And so rather than a specific piece of news, the bigger story is the change that the medium has brought to society as a whole. And so if you look at something like Twitter, right? Twitter is a new medium. And so what it basically means is now how you think and your reputation and your ideas, they're open for the world to see, right? And in the past, if I wanted to know what you think, the only way would have been that you wrote a book, got it approved, and got it published, then got it in a library, and then I go there and try to find that book, and then I can open it up, and I can try to discover your ideas. And if I want to know your reputation in the past, I would probably have to go and try to find people and ask them about you. Now I can just look up your Twitter, see how many followers you have, and see the tweets and see what's on your mind. So Twitter it's a new medium, it's a new fabric of society. And so in the very same way, when you look at the electricity coming in the home of the people after 1935, I would encourage you to think like of the big picture and not like what specifically people were doing, but what this medium of electricity brought into those people's life. And so what it brought is it essentially gave them time and labor as a commodity, right? Or now, if it's the evening and you cannot read anymore, like it's too late, well, just use a bulb light. And so now you sort of turn the money into time. You can buy a bit more time, right? Because like you can have artificial light. If you have to do the dishwasher, it's labor, well, now you can buy it. You can buy like a specific dishwasher or whatever that is. The stuff you have to do in the house, that labor, you can buy it with money. You can convert money into labor. So that was, I believe, in the 20th century, the first big new medium was the rise of electricity in the house of every American. Now, forward a few decades later, and comes the other big medium. That's like the 60s, right? That's like the whole information age kind of thing, which basically is like the internet and people starting to build networks. And when I think of the internet, and by the way, I think it's a funny exercise to sort of go step back and like, oh, how would people define the internet back then, right? And I think one interesting way to do that is, have you seen that interview from Bill Gates from 1995?
Yes, I did. Multiple times.
Exactly. Right? It's a really good one, right?
It's a great one. It's a great articulation of the fallacy of, not the fallacy, but like how humane and natural it is to not understand what is going to come because it seems so mundane to a level that makes you feel like what we have today is good enough, but innovation
Exactly.
is the antithesis to good enough, right?
Exactly.
Horses were good enough. Yellow pages and books were good enough. And then the internet
Petroleum
changed
light
everything.
was good enough.
Exactly.
And then electricity
right?
comes in and
yeah, sunlight was good enough. The moon was good enough as light, right? You're talking about electrification. I like how you thought about as you can basically buy more time by putting a light bulb in your house, and that gives you more resources to do more of something, right? And essentially extending the lifespan of a day.
Exactly. And so if you use my mental framework to think about the internet, obviously the new commodity with the internet, and if you remember that interview, Bill Gates' answer, I think, was the internet is the place where you find information, companies, and where you send electronic mail. And that's the thing. The thing that the internet brought to us is instantaneous information, right? It's now you can sort of exchange money, not in exchange for information, but in exchange for the speed at which information is processed. I think there was a little bit like sociologists in the 60s, they called it the information age. I think they slightly missed it. I don't think information increased because of the internet. I just think information became more instantaneous. And I think that's quite an important distinction. Now, with the internet, you can pay to make it faster to find it, right? Google, Yahoo, whatever. You can pay to make it faster to consume it, right? Like you can read those books, find those maybe summary of books, and make it easier to publish it. You can just open up Twitter and publish stuff on it. So what the internet commoditized is the speed of information. Okay, so we said 30s, what you can buy is labor and time with electricity. 60s and upwards of the 90s and 2000s, what you can buy and get more of with your money is the speed at which you access information and publish it and find it. And so now, of course, what is the third biggest paradigm, in my opinion? The third biggest one would be what we would call the metaverse. And the thing that you get with the metaverse in exchange for money is the feeling of presence, right? And I've seen 1,000 definitions of the metaverse. A lot of them I don't particularly connect with. I think a much simpler one is that the metaverse basically allows you to do that, to exchange money for instantaneous feeling of presence. And in that sense, the metaverse kind of already existed when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid and I would go on Minecraft and hang out with my friend, I would actually feel like I was with them. So that whole thing, so what you find is that the metaverse already existed, and I think it's going to just something that might grow and become mainstream. But the point of the metaverse isn't cross-compatibility, or it's not three-dimensional. It's really making that feeling of presence instantaneous. A simple story I can tell you, one of my best friends when I was a kid, he moved out to the complete other side of the country. If you go back to that sentence I said at the beginning, the medium is the message. Well, with the medium of the metaverse, the change that it made in society is that I think his parents felt more comfortable moving where they wanted to move because they knew that he was still going to hang out with his friends, right? And why was he still going to hang out with his friends? Because we hang out in Minecraft anyway. And that's like a sort of profound change in society. And that changes traces back to that, traces back to the fact that now you can take your money, buy a computer, buy Minecraft, and install those games and those modes and log into it and feel like we're actually in the same room, even though we're not. And so that would be how I define the metaverse. And that's my whole thesis of the metaverse, that the metaverse is the new medium for most of the interactions in society. And it's one that is about presence.
Are we in the metaverse now? Are we in the metaverse now?
Are we in the metaverse now? Those are always slightly tricky questions, right? Because...
Well, let me ask it differently. Because I had Tim O'Reilly on the podcast in last year in 2022, and his definition of the metaverse was to some extent that it's a point of time where people come together in a digital space. And by that definition, a recording on Riverside or doing a Zoom call, that is an example of being in the metaverse. And so I'm wondering, and again, there's a lot of opinions, including my own, is to be in the metaverse or to have that instantaneous sense of presence, as you described it, does it have to be in 3D? Does it have to be from a certain gateway? And does it have to be with with more people?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And maybe there's more pillars. I'm just curious about those particular things, right? Is there a certain gateway? Is there a certain device or a computing ecosystem in order to feel that instantaneous sense of presence? Does it have to be with many more people? I.e., does it have to be multiplayer or multi-user? And does it have to be three-dimensional? I'm curious about your perspective.
I see. I love that question. And I'm going to answer it in a first sort of tackling it in a slightly tangential way by saying that I think just like there were a spectrum to electrification, and just like there was a spectrum to internetification, right? Where having a website that showed you the phone number of the pizzeria, and then you have to call it, and then they deliver it to you, is a lesser implementation of the internet than having Uber Eats on my phone. They're sort of both on the internet, but on that spectrum, this is a lesser version of it. And of course, what I'm hinting at is that the same thing would apply to the metaverse, where you have lesser version of it. So with that out of the way, the point of the question would be, well, on that spectrum, where is the point that we cross where it becomes truly useful and truly comes into the mainstream, right? And if I take it this way, I would say the following. Let's start with multiplayer. I don't think it actually needs to be multiplayer. I actually think people experienced something pretty impressive recently. Some people might never have experienced that before when they talked with ChatGPT, or they might have felt like they were talking with an actual real human. They might have felt, even though it was very limited text, they might have felt almost the beginning of the feeling of presence. Well, in the metaverse, right, you can imagine a ChatGPT, not 1 or 2, but ChatGPT 45. And when that happens, you might have a very, very convincing sense of presence with something that is not another person. It might even be a pet or a virtual animal or whatever that is. So that's on multiplayer. Now on specific device as a sort of gateway to get there. Well, that's where my tech comes in. And my tech would be, I would imagine that most of the interaction in the metaverse are going to happen in VR. The vast majority of it. When we were kids, Minecraft was good enough for us. I don't think it is for most people. And especially when, VR gets 10,000 times better, people are going to be drawn towards it. And I think VR is going to play VR, AR. I'm kind of using the term very liberally here. You can kind of assume when I say VR, I'm actually of the belief that VR, AR, XR, all of those things, slightly pointless terms, all of those things are kind of converging towards the same thing anyway.
I like how one of my previous guests, Richard, he was formerly at McKinsey, said he called all of those things full body computing, which I thought is an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of putting it. I will say this, the more we add terms,
the more complex and confusing the conversation becomes, and we lose the focus on the substance.
Exactly. So I think the list is getting longer. You can assume I'm talking about pretty much everything in that list when I say VR. And then your other question was, should it be three-dimensional? And again, I will say, for it to be mainstream, yes, I do suspect that it needs to be three-dimensional. And I want to sort of back up my claims with the following proposition, which is you could have had very impressive gaming experiences in the 80s or even 70s with text-based games. Like in terms of feeling, the feelings that people have when they play games. With text-based stuff on computers, there were some very impressive stuff that were very popular with a small subset of the population back then. So I would have called that gaming back then. But for gaming to really be the thing mainstream that we consider as society as like actual gaming, now you need graphics, you need a powerful GPU, and you need that to run on a big display and be either 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional. The same thing with the metaverse. I think what we call right now metaverse, when we talk about Minecraft, stuff like that, is a small group of people, and everyone will have forgotten about that era. And when people get to talk about metaverse, I think it's going to be very much VR driven.
Interesting. Okay, that's a great segue to let's talk about Unai. Tell me a bit about what are you guys building? What's sort of the vision of the product of the company? And why is it going to be unique and differentiated from anything else that we're seeing at the moment?
Sure. So maybe let me start with a little bit of a step back and give some context about the company. As I mentioned, after I open sourced my first VR headset, I went deep into VR and kept using it every day and sort of went into research. And then the turning point was the Quest 2. The Quest 2 came out and all my friends bought it and all my friends used it every day for a week. And then after 1 week, they stopped using it, they put it on a shelf, and it's collecting dust. And I've told that story many times, and simply because that's just how it is, and it resonates with everyone because that's most people's experience of VR as well. All right. And my feeling at the time was, I'm pretty sure I can fix that. And the path towards fixing that is not an obvious one, but there are some clear indicators of what it takes to fix that. Some of it has to do with the uncomfortableness of VR, which itself is a mix of hardware and a mix of software and sort of performances and latency and refresh rate and those kind of technical things. Some of it has to do with design, the rough edges of the experience, how hard it is to set up, or the nature of the experiences themselves. Some of it has to do with the messaging and the marketing, where most people really don't have a grasp of even what VR is for, including the people working at Meta, where they have a hard time articulating those kind of things. So my feeling at this time was someone could fix it. And so I went out there and talked to many people I knew at those big companies. And I explained to them, hey, a lot of these things are well researched. This is how we could fix VR. And so my friend over at Unity said, that sounds amazing. You should go and ask NVIDIA to build it. My friend at NVIDIA said, that sounds amazing. You should go and ask Qualcomm to build it. And my friend at Qualcomm were like, that sounds amazing. I wonder who's going to build this. So at that point in time, that's about when I reached out to Naval Ravikant, an investor from the Valley. And he convinced me to start a company, was one of our first investors. And David from Unity, the founder of Unity, came in as well. A few other fantastic, great people invested as well. And I decided on taking on those challenges myself and try to build a headset that people would actually use and that wouldn't sit on a shelf collecting dust. And maybe one that is more niche, but one that people actually use and keep using every day. So that was the premise, that was the starting point. And as a tiny bit more context about the company, we're very secretive. We've been extremely stealthy about every single thing that we've done. We don't have a website or anything. We've been quite secretive. We've raised 2 rounds of funding. We're currently the best funded VR hardware startup out there. And we've assembled a team that I'm very proud of every day. People from Apple, people from Meta, people from Sony, and from a few other places. All people that have tremendous experience in the industry. Some of those people that you probably have seen before if you've ever watched the Apple keynotes and stuff like that. So fantastic team that I'm very proud to be a part of. And we've been working on this for a little while now. So sort of that's the high level context of the company. Now, to answer your question of what are we doing differently, that ties back to your first question on why did I disagree with Meta. I gave you the very high level sort of abstract answer. Now I can give you a little more about the long tail of small details. Although I have to admit, those conversations are always a little tough for me, because as much as I'm dying to tell more about people about our headset, on the other hand, we've also been very secretive, and that's something we'll keep on being for a little while.
No, I totally get it. And I think what would be great is anything that you feel can be of substance to understand why you're going to do it differently, why people will really are going to want to use it, as you said, and I agree. People should want to use it. I'm one of those who used it once and twice and put it back. It's just not fun. It's not fun. It's not comfortable. It's not great. It's painful it's really heavy and hot on my head. And, and I think as older as you get, it's even more. But I understand you guys are at a stealth stage. So only share what you feel comfortable with. I'm not trying to put you in a difficult position. I don't want you to share anything you're not comfortable with, but put it in the context of why is it going to work? Why is it going to be different? So I know it's a sensitive line to thread, but I'll give you the credit for trying, and let's give it a try, and then we can move on and talk about something else.
Awesome. So let's do it. We can talk about 3 things that are really fundamental. And the first one would be comfort. My second one would be smoothness of experience. And I would say my third one is tooling and making it a tool. So first one, comfort. Let's talk a little bit about, I hate to criticize them because I think they're wonderful people and I love hiring them, but let's criticize a little bit the approach of the other people in the industry. Let's talk about how comfort is handled at Oculus and why I disagree with that. Here's the rough process for how their VR headset is designed. Leadership comes into a room and says, what key features are needed for VR to become mainstream? What are we missing that is required to get to 1 billion users? And everywhere on the world it's written, we're going to get to 1 billion users. What is the magic feature to get there? And eye tracking, face tracking, and you add more features, right? And the list gets pretty long because you need a ton of stuff. You need body tracking, facial tracking, foveated rendering, eye tracking, voice cancellation, and this, like all this complicated stuff. Okay. Now you assemble a team, find a great architect for that team, build different lines of prototypes to try each one of those features individually, then assemble all of those different prototypes into a single, bigger, more complex prototype that is one of those huge devices that if you've watched Mark Zuckerberg's video, that thing that he's holding like this with 2 hands, like to show up.
Grade equipment.
Exactly, right? So you get to building those huge stuff, so huge, in fact, that you're probably going to put a cable to that VR headset and like sort of hang the cable on the ceiling. I'm not kidding. Like it's that big, that huge. And then you get that and you have all those features and you ask, is it better? Yes or no? And how much better is it? And, oh yeah, it's much better. Yeah, those features are really good. And also someone just asked for that feature and leadership just asked for it. So you kind of have to build it anyway. So once you get to that stage, then you try to make it as small as possible. So you try to assemble that, reduce the size of the features, and you're on a tight schedule because there's a new SoC coming soon from Qualcomm. Theoretically, I'm not breaking any NDA here, but let's theoretically imagine there's a new SoC coming up. So you're on that tight schedule and you try to imagine how much power it's going to take and the power management of that. And you sort of build a prototype, and by EVT engineering validation, you've sort of managed to make it a little smaller, and then you're going to try to ask industrial design to package this bunch of electronics that you have. There's going to be a little bit of back and forth between industrial design and electronics. And then at some point, sort of, you got to ship, you got to put all those features into a box and you close it up and you call that a headset and you sell it. And that's how most VR headsets are made. And my point of view on this is that's not at all how you should be making a VR headset. It might sound reasonable, but to me, that sounds kind of insane to be building a VR headset like this. Because a VR headset is, if you think of it like a piece of clothing, for instance, then you kind of want to ask yourself first about comfort. And one thing I can share, and so if you're working in VR and you like that way of thinking, you probably should apply and come work with us. We're hiring a lot of people. But the way we're approaching this is we designed a bunch of stuff, bunch of different form factors, bunch of different designs and styles of headset. We put them on our heads and we say, do we like it? Does it feel good? Does it feel comfortable? Does it look cool? And by the way, like, that's a big deal. Like, if you look like a dork, good luck making that a mainstream device. So does it look cool? Is it comfortable? Does it leave marks all over my face? Does it mess up with my hair? The stuff that people actually care about. And we try those things and we try to find the breaking points. How heavy is too heavy? How much messing with the hair is too much messing with the hair? How much pressure on the face is too much? And once we've defined those breaking points, we do the opposite. We say, hey, what features can we fit into that form factor? And so we do that thing the other way, and then we arrive, oh, that feature, but cannot make the cut. We cannot put everything into that. And actually, let's make sure that we really nail comfort. And this just changes widely the way the organization is built. It changes widely who is in power in the company and like who's making decisions. It changes widely the management structure of the company, and changes widely the end product, the end result. So that would be my thesis on comfort. Does it make sense?
It does.
The second one would be streamlinedness and robustness. Well, long story short, when I described the VR use case, I was not completely accurate. A more accurate statement would have been, I put the headset on the shelf, it's collecting dust, then a few months later, a family or a friend comes and visit my house and like, oh, what's that thing? I'm like, that's a VR headset. Do you want to try it? Like, yeah, I would love to try it. Then I take it, dust it off, try to turn it on, nothing happens. Try again, nothing happens. Oh, try again. Oh, okay. Because actually you have to press that button for longer and there's no visual feedback. So you didn't know. Okay, press the button longer. Oh, there's a light blinking. It's working, but no battery. Okay, I'm just going to put it on and put it to charge. And then it charged for about 2.5 hours. And once it charged, I turn it back on again and I'm about to use it. And for some reason, that thing is not paired with my phone anymore. I don't really know why. It's a weird bug. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to pair it again with my phone. It's not paired anymore. Now it's paired. Now I have to update it. All right, that's fine. I'm just going to update the headset. It's updating, and now I want to play with it. And I try to play with it, and it turns out I cannot use it because I have to log in, and my Oculus account is not working, and I have to go on the website, and I cannot do it from my phone. I have to be on the laptop. So I go on the laptop, go on the website, and it tells me, oh, I have to convert my Oculus account into a Meta account. So I convert the Oculus account into a Meta account. And then I go back to the headset and I log into it and update everything. I'm like, okay, now I can finally play with my friends. And then you open up the app to play with friends and you realize that app has to be updated individually from the OS. So now I have to update that app. And then finally I go into this app and finally I'm connected with my friends in the Oculus friend kind of thing. And I start, let's say, Demeo. One of my, shout out to developers, one of my favorite games these days. By the way, like that part of the story I'm about to tell, that's literally what happened to me not so long ago. Because my bad, I was using one of Meta's VR headsets. Shouldn't have done that, should have used my own. But on that occasion, I was using one of their headsets. My friend and I are in the Meta multiplayer kind of thing. And now we go into the multiplayer of Demeo. And we're not together. It's not working. I tell him, oh, yeah, of course. That's because we're together with the Meta thing, but not together in the Demeo thing. Even though the Demeo thing uses the API from Facebook, but somehow it does not understand. So now we have to leave the game, leave the multiplayer from Meta, start up the game again, be in the multiplayer in the game, and then there's a secret code that I have to give him. So I have to take off the headset and text him the secret code. And I'm going to stop the story there, right? Because I took it long, but frankly, I could walk you through this for hours and hours because it's always like this. It is every single tiniest thing is like a nightmare. I lose my patience every time I use other VR products because I cannot wrap my hand around it. It's like always like this. I cannot use any of those stuff. Those stuff, they drive me crazy. So I would much rather use my own stuff. So why? Because our own VR headset, we're trying super hard to make everything as streamlined, easy to use as possible. And that's one of the things we're optimizing for. And you basically have this sort of a hard and fast rule in the company where everyone every single day tries the stuff. And if it's too complicated or if there are too many steps to use it, people just tell you, hey, I'm not going to use it. Fix your stuff. And otherwise, like no one is going to try your stuff. Your stuff is not done until it's easy to use. And it turns out everyone wants to make it easy to use anyway. So everyone is super happy that everyone is helping everyone else make the stuff super streamlined and super easy to use. And I think it's a failure of execution on Metasport. I think everyone can relate to that. And as for, is there a secret sauce that we have to solve for that? The truth is no, there is not. It's only time and boring, long effort and sweat and sitting down in front of the computer and writing code and designing stuff and putting in the time to streamline those rough edges. That's my second point. And my third and last point would be expandability. And it's funny because I wrote a tweet about that one not long ago and my inbox was flooded with people disagreeing with me. So let me make my case again, and let me even make my case a little bit more extreme, such as to be a little more, even more polarizing than I was when I tweeted that, because I actually do think it's important. The premise was, on the web, theoretically, I can kind of just write some HTML, write some CSS, put it out there. It's a website. I don't have to ask anybody for their authorization. And the stuff is out there. And in 5 minutes, all my friends and family can go up on the website and try it. It's super easy to build something quickly, put it out there, deploy it, and have other people try out that thing and share it with your friends. Now, that's getting a little bit hijacked by like modern web development, but I'm not interested in getting into that. Now, if I look at VR development, that's a completely other beast. It is hard and a very not enjoyable process to develop stuff for VR. And I say this as someone who's built and helped build many SDKs for VR development. And some of the stuff I wrote sort of still exists in some way or form in other companies and in the industry. And I can tell you, it was bad, what I did back then. And the stuff that is out there today is still pretty bad. And basically, before you can do anything, you have gigabytes and gigabytes of stuff to download. The stuff is always breaking. You have so many different standards that are supposedly, for the past few years, just about to all come under the same standard. And it's hard to design for, and the equipment itself is not reliable. Like the hardware itself, if you've ever used some of the VR headsets that are out there, on, say, different operating system, for instance, I've had so many bad experiences where the stuff just broke and it's not robust, and basically does not have the feeling of a reliable tool that you can do professional stuff with. It always feels slightly hacky, slightly just put together last minute, and pretty hard to use. And people challenged the idea that it was hard to use, because you just have to install Unity, install this, install that, and you can get something to work on it. My pushback here would be, if I take a Raspberry Pi, any kid, which is like, it's a super small, for those who don't know, it's a super small computer. You can just install Linux on an SD card, plug that SD card in, turn on the Raspberry Pi, open up Python, type 5 or 6 lines of code, and there's going to be a display that shows up. And then with a few sort of little piece of code, you can add a little image and a little maybe cube and a little this and a little that, and you can have kids being creatives. I challenge you to try and do that with VR. It's going to be incredibly hard for those kids to be able to build anything. And even if they do manage to build anything, for them to make it into something interesting, it will require some sort of professional level of experience. And the platform are actually trying to address this. Rec Room tries to help users develop stuff. VR Chat tries to help the user develop that. But actually think, and I really appreciate them for doing that. I have a lot of admiration and appreciation for those platforms. But I actually think that the people making the hardware itself should make the hardware robust for developers and easily expandable for people and various professionals. And that's something we also take very seriously. And I know that we want kids in classroom to be able to super easily use the headset. and create stuff for it. Not just be passive users, but actually create stuff for it. And that's also something that is having a huge impact in the way we're developing that headset.
Let me switch gears, and thank you for that. I think it's super clear in terms of all of the components that don't exist today and why it's important to get them right across, comfort, user experience. How do you create something that can enable an ecosystem to thrive? All of these, I think, are critical success factors for something that will be actually usable and people want to build for and use. Which actually leads me to one last key question I have, which is, let's call it the elephant in the room. There is this tiny company that has been quite successful over the past 20 years. It's called Apple. And in a way, Apple has organically monopolized consumer tech because just they've built not only incredibly intuitive devices, primarily the iPhone, but also there are other devices, but primarily the iPhone, that then inspired a whole new ecosystem to be built on top with applications and kind of locking in people into the experience. And I think we all give them credit for building this incredible machine, incredible user experience, incredible design, and a lot have been already said about that. So that company, Apple, is obviously working on something, which recently I saw is now being delayed and it's not going to be launched until 2024. And we'll see if it actually goes in 2024. So without knowing too much what they're working on or what they're actually going to launch, just knowing they're going to do something in this space, let's assume they do it right. If they do it wrong, it's not relevant. But let's assume they do it right. And let me define, what does it mean if they do it right? They do it right would mean that they actually build something that would feel potentially like the iPhone moment of mixed reality computing and devices. So let's assume that's going to happen. If it's going to happen, and suddenly Apple is going to have a mixed reality headset that inspires, that first of all is easy and fun to use, that also inspires creation on top of the ecosystem. If that were to happen, how do you think it would impact the wider landscape of the category? And more specifically, what would it mean for you as Unai?
Sure. Well, let's start with a caveat. I'm probably one of the person who spends the most time interviewing people working at Apple on their stuff. And I can tell you, I cannot tell you what they're working on. It's an incredibly secretive company. They work on so many projects in parallel. And I'm very careful with the rumors that are out there, and even careful with the prototypes that kind of are out there, because there are just so many teams working on so many stuff in parallel. So let me tell you a little bit about the mantra of Unai. We try not to pay too much attention to those rumors, because otherwise you don't build anything. If you're sort of scared of the ghost in the other room and you don't build anything because of that. Instead, we try to assume that they're going to build the very best VR headset that we think they will. And we try to ask ourselves, how can we compete with the very best possible VR headset that we know for a fact they're going to release? And we just assume that they're going to release it in our work. And the way I feel is, in such a young and nascent industry, I know it's going to be a little vague, but we don't feel like Apple still has, I think they kind of lost the plot for going into something so risky and with so many unknowns. And what I mean by that is, right now, a lot of the stuff that is actually working in VR is kind of controversial. It's not exactly the stuff you would put in large and big on the keynote. And the reason is the industry is still pretty young. And you look at the very young people using VR. The people right now that are using VR every day are either using VR chat, and I guarantee you VR chat does not really qualify for the kind of stuff that Apple wants to promote, because it's so young that they are having so many issues. I mean, I'll tell you frankly, recently there was a kidnapping of a kid because he was in VR chat, and someone older groomed that kid in VR chat. Those platforms are having this kind of huge problems. If you're Apple, you want to steer away from that. You have so much to lose, so little to gain. And really so little to gain when you can just like spin up the new AirPods. And the other stuff, like generally like those other stuff that are very much used by kids, kind of want to steer away from them anyway. Because the grooming, but also the mental health impact that has not been studied enough, or also just not having to testify in front of Senate about this kind of stuff. VR chat had those issues. No, it's such a small company, no one is going to have them testify in front of Congress. If Apple has anything close to that, they're going to have to testify in front of Congress. You know what I mean? So I think they'll want to steer clear of these issues. But I think that at the same time, the advantage that my company has is that we can go straight into those problems and try for ourselves to figure them out. We have conviction on how to figure them out, and we might fail, we might make some mistake, but we're willing to make them because we have much less to lose than Apple. And I think that overall, we've entered in an era of post-guilt for Apple and Meta, where they see every single day the negative consequences of what they built. You know, I think a lot of the key decision makers at Apple, a lot of their key industrial designers, they have mixed feelings about smartphones and people addicted to their smartphones and kids and people spending too much time on Instagram. I think they have mixed feelings about that. I think this is making them extremely cautious. I think they ask themselves 20 times a day, should we really build that headset? Should we really build that thing? And I think this is making them extremely risk averse, and actually believe that right now, most of the stuff that is getting me excited in the space, whether that be really on the edge artists or on the edge completely new weird apps, those are those kind of stuff they would still steer clear of.
I like that. I think being a rebel, I think being a rebel and being differentiated on that front is going to be very important. If you play in the playing field of Apple, you'll likely lose. So you cannot go for safe. You got to go for rebel, for different, for wacky. I mean, think different. That was Apple's mantra always. That's probably no longer the case. Now it's how do we build the next moat? My perspective is twofold. One, I think it's good for Unai and other players in VR, kind of emerging companies, to have Apple succeeding. I think it's going to be great. It will drive all the attention and awareness. It will help drive forward the ecosystem, right? There is the saying, rising tides lift all boats. I think the VR industry needs the lift because Meta is just not lifting anything, to be honest. Right. It's just not lifting anything. Quite the opposite. No one really has belief or even excitement about what Meta is doing with VR and virtual worlds, etc. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I think because of Apple's safety, I believe, and I think that would not be a bad case scenario, by the way. I do not see how their VR headset become the next iPhone. I think it could well be the next iWatch, i.e. they can build something that sells a lot, but it's not going to be at the level of the iPhone. It could be in the level of the iWatch, which again, wouldn't be a bad outcome. It's not what probably people imagine. And then you have an opportunity to really build a differentiated product that is more about the differentiators, the wacky creators, the rebel, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's good. I think that's good because the barrier to entry anyway with a product category like that is already very high. I don't anticipate there's going to be many competitors, many players. I think there are going to be a few early stage emerging companies, and there's going to be all the big corporations that are trying to win it. Samsung, HTC, right? Lenovo, who knows, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Magic Leap. I mean, they're all going to want to get into the consumer market when it comes to these type of devices. So go for the rebels, go for the difference, go for the wacky, and, you know, empower the bottom up. The almost like what does VR powered, what does a UGC powered VR ecosystem looks like, right? You're talking about VR chat, rec rooms, so on and so forth. I mean, Roblox is not doing it in VR at the moment. Not surprisingly, they're probably waiting. There is rumors they're going to do something on Meta and Oculus. Sure, that can happen. there's less than 0.5% of users on Roblox that access Roblox experiences through VR. That will change. That will also change because Roblox is going to want to enable people to build experiences that other people can access through VR. That's going to happen. Right? And so how do you build something that is going to be relevant for those emerging platforms who are driving a lot of attention and where under 25-year-olds spend majority of their time? People on Roblox still spend almost 2.5 hours a day on the platform, 60 million daily active users. There's no other platform at that scale when it comes to access content in 3D. So fascinating. Maxim, thank you so much for joining. This has been a fantastic conversation. I know we haven't digged in too much about Unai, but I know it's going to be exciting to keep a tab on the progress of the project. And hopefully I'll get you on board for another chat down the line to talk about it and about what other things happening in the ecosystem, including what Apple is doing. The last question I have, am I correct to assume that the name of the company Unai is basically UNI, or am I wrong?
Yes, it is.
That's what I thought. It's great. It's a beautiful name. So Unai, for folks who listen, it means UNI, Unai. That's the name of the company.
Exactly.
Any last thing you want to mention, Maxim?
You can follow me on Twitter, Maxim_XYZ. We're hiring a lot of people, a lot of talented folks. If you want to come on board and work with us, definitely shoot me an email.
Excellent. Please do. And thank you again, Maxim. It was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Into the Metaverse. We hope you learned a lot and explored new aspects of the Metaverse.